Bueno, señoras y señores, ya tenemos a nuestros panelistas, tenemos también a nuestra moderadora y para mí es un inmenso placer poder presentar a quien va a ser nuestra moderadora, a Milagros Salazar, que llega desde Lima a Perú. Le damos la bienvenida con este cálido aplauso y que nos va a presentar en esta oportunidad a Milagros, por supuesto, a Kristen Morgan, a Alice Ting, nuestras panelistas, el papel de la mujer en la transformación de la industria informativa. Con todos ustedes, bienvenidas.
¿Cómo está? Muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Milagros Salazar, soy periodista y directora de Convoca.p, medio digital de periodismo de investigación con sede en Lima. Pertenezco a un movimiento de nuevos medios fundados por periodistas, donde hay un gran liderazgo de mujeres que se dedican al periodismo de investigación. Veo acá a Nuria y algunas de ellas, acá Emilia Delfino también de perfil. Tengo el honor de presentar a este panel integrado por mujeres destacadas en los diferentes roles que cumplen en la industria de los medios, en un panel que se ha denominado el papel de la mujer en la transformación de la industria informativa. Una industria que a lo largo de la conferencia se ha señalado que está marcado por diversos desafíos como la desinformación, ante el boom del internet, la sostenibilidad, el desafío de ser sostenible cada vez más a la industria, la importancia de fortalecer el periodismo y por lo tanto la democracia, y a esto podemos sumarle también la lucha frente a la igualdad de género, que es uno de los temas también de los que precisamente en la mesa se va a conversar. En esta mesa nos acompaña Kristen Morgan de Bloomberg. Ella dirige la distribución de contenidos y alianza para Iberoamérica en Bloomberg Media. Ella es responsable de crear asociaciones editoriales y contribuir contenido en medios y plataformas educativas y corporaciones en la región. Kristen, también nos acompaña Alice Ting, que ella es de New York Times. Ella es vicepresidenta de licencias y sindicación de este medio. Y también Norma Morandini, que bueno, para los argentinos no necesita mayor presentación porque es una gran referente en la opinión pública en Argentina. Es columnista y política, ha sido diputada, senadora nacional y candidata a la vicepresidencia y actualmente dirige el Observatorio de Derechos Humanos del Senado. Vamos a conversar e iniciar en realidad este panel con la participación de Kristen Morgan. Ella nos ha preparado una presentación. ¿Te doy el pase? ¿Sí?
Buenos días. Yo creo que voy a intentar empezar por lo menos en español, si puedo. Y les pido perdón si acabo hablando Spanglish, pero me gustaría practicar un poco ya que estoy aquí en Salta, una ciudad maravillosa. Como habías dicho, soy Kristen Morgan, soy la jefa de contenidos de las Américas y alianzas estratégicas. Quería, para empezar, dar un poco de background de Bloomberg, de dónde empezamos y en qué estamos haciendo para crecer la diversidad dentro de nuestra empresa. Entonces, si me permites, quería dar un poco de background de Michael Bloomberg y hablamos mucho de la disruption, ¿no?, en esta industria de noticias. Y me gusta hacer un paralelo porque Michael Bloomberg, en su época, cuando empezó nuestra empresa, en 1981, pensó que su negocio, que es financial technology, necesitaba mucho el disruption también dentro de la industria. Entonces ahí dice, from the beginning, I was convinced we were doing something no one else could do. Es muy importante porque yo creo que en nuestra área de media, donde hay mucha presión, ¿no?, en nuestro negocio, de las plataformas, el caimiento en publicidad, es muy importante siempre buscar otras maneras de desarrollar nuestro negocio. Hoy en día nuestra presencia es en 73 países alrededor del mundo Y hoy en día, empezando, te ve aquí la foto de Michael Bloomberg con sus 3 socios. En 81, hoy en día tenemos casi 20,000 personas en la empresa. Es interesante, curioso, que cuando ves las empresas grandes de media en los Estados Unidos, o por lo menos en el área de noticias, muchos de ellos están enfocados en 1, 2, 3 plataformas. Nosotros tenemos 5 o 6 plataformas dentro de Bloomberg, porque es curioso porque la empresa empezó, o por lo menos Bloomberg Media, que es una parte de Bloomberg LP, ha empezado para apoyar nuestro negocio fundamental, que es el computador, vamos a decir, o es un software que es una base de datos y noticias que presta servicios al mundo financiero. 10 años después que empezó la empresa, desarrolló nuestra redacción para complementar los datos que ya estaban dentro de Bloomberg. Y de ahí fue expandiendo. Empezamos con una plataforma de televisión, luego de radio. Bloomberg Business Week compramos en 2007 y ahora tenemos eventos, tenemos Bloomberg.com y algunas otras cosas. Tenemos un grupo editorial muy grande, es porque para apoyar el Bloomberg, el terminal de Bloomberg, tenemos 2,700 periodistas en todos los cantos del mundo, con más de 120 bureaus y enfocados en varias verticales, mucho más que solamente los mercados. También negocios en general, tecnología, la política, el segmento de lujo y algunos más, la industria de salud y otras áreas también. Yo trabajo en la parte de media, que está encargado de sacar todas las noticias, los videos, de fotos que producimos dentro de la redacción y distribuirlos a las varias publicaciones, corporaciones, como Milagros había dicho, también a plataformas educativas que necesitan nuestros contenidos para complementar su oferta. Y tenemos varias alianzas, otra vez, alrededor del mundo, que está a veces que es una sociedad, una alianza basada en la tele, pero hemos hecho también varios esfuerzos de crecer nuestra presencia digital. Y las 2 semanas atrás hemos empezado una alianza con una nueva empresa de media en Chile que se llama Pauta, con un programa de radio súper interesante por las mañanas y algunos otros ahí por el mundo. Ahora, ¿qué estamos haciendo en términos de igualdad dentro del newsroom en la redacción? Tal vez yo paso a inglés si puedo, ¿sí? There's been a large effort since the beginning of the year to really ensure that we're finding equal representation in our reporting and bringing women into our reporting much more often. We started a program in April. In fact, it was a little bit earlier than that, but in April earlier this year, one of our global standards and diversity leads within the newsroom began to look at how we can ensure that, again, we're finding balance and coverage across all of our platforms, not just in our news, but also in television and in radio, to reduce biases in our reporting. So we did a couple of things. One was there was a very conscious effort to, again, increase the number of sources that we incorporated into our news. As you imagine, again, a lot of our reporting is focused on the financial industry along the lines of markets and business, and so you do naturally have many men. It's quite a male-dominated industry. But we made a conscious effort to build out a database, frankly, of female experts within the industry that our reporters could tap on or tap into when they were trying to create a story around certain areas. We made sure that women were being featured much more often, if possible, within TV or radio and our events. We actually started a media training program. So what was interesting, I was telling the ladies before, was we've always sought to have women on TV. We've always sought to bring in women in radio and various other of our platforms. But it was interesting. I was talking to Laura Zelenko, again, our global standards person, and she said, oftentimes in television, at least in our organization, women will find an excuse not to be able to come onto television. They'll say, oh, you know, it takes me more time because I need to do my makeup, or I just don't feel like I have the proper training and I don't feel comfortable presenting on television. So what the newsroom sought to do was go out and actually create, again, a training program where women executives within the financial industry and sort of at the top of their business could come in. We would give them training, and not only could we would benefit because they would speak on Bloomberg Television, but they could go on to CNBC, onto any other sort of business channel within the Americas and have deliver real dialogue. So again, helping us increase our diversity. We institutionalize this within the newsroom as being a really important part of everybody's jobs, within the jobs of the managers within the newsroom. So in fact, there are metrics now that each one of the managers have within their group as they're looking to, at the end of the year, evaluate their journalists and their editors. They actually go in and identify how often they've been sourcing women within their reporting. You can see actually down tactically, there's actually tagging that our editors will put onto their stories, and when they have quoted a woman in the story, they will tag it as BN, which is Bloomberg News, she said. So it's a very good and kind of easy way for us to then get data on the back end to ensure that, again, we can track how much more we're able to incorporate women. What has that done? What are the results that we've seen? So essentially, since we started this at the beginning of the year, we've seen that the number of women in that database that I was describing has increased from 500 to 2,300 experts within their fields. In the first quarter of the year, we've seen that 10 to 15, the growth in the number of women who have been on Bloomberg Television. Again, just in one quarter, we increased from 10 to 15%. As you can imagine, that's grown actually quarter after quarter. Again, start of the year, we were at 28% in terms of the number of women journalists on television. That's increased now by that increased to 35% or 34% in the first quarter, and again, continues to grow. And then as we looked at the top stories that made sort of top headline or top news within Bloomberg, the terminal as well as around the world, in media, we've seen that that's grown from a very underwhelming 2% to about 6%. But again, that number is rapidly growing quarter after quarter as well. And finally, it's really interesting. One of the things that I think our newsroom has been really interested in ensuring is that women, when we're asked within the newsroom to actually go and speak on panels, we always ask the question, are there any other women on the panel? We don't want to be the only women on the panels. So we've actually made sure that we're getting equal representation as we're going out and speaking about our organization or about our specific topic areas. And in addition to that, in our events that we run, because we have a pretty healthy events business, we've seen that since 2017 to 2018, we've grown the number of women on our panels from about 19% to 35%. And that will continue to grow as well. So that kind of gives you a sense, I think, within the newsroom of some of the really impactful work that the team is doing. I thought it would be helpful to also talk a little bit more about, given that we're such a data-driven organization, some of the data things that we're doing to help companies understand how well they are diversifying their workforce. In 2016, we instituted a gender index, or gender equality index, excuse me. And this essentially is looking at companies that want to participate within our index because investors, they want to ensure that they're communicating to their investors about how diverse and how, and again, when I say diversity, Alice and I were talking about this, when I say diversity, we're not just talking about gender diversity. There's a true commitment to diversity of people of color, people of different sexual orientation. There's a huge focus within our organization. We have a chief diversity and inclusion officer who's ensuring that every part of our business is aware and is paying attention to this. But back to the index. The index is self-selective, so companies who want to participate into it can join, and there's some sort of vetting process that we organize. But essentially, what we're trying to do is look at their company statistics, how many employees, or what are their policies internally about employee diversity, are they offering products that are gender conscious? You can see some of the other metrics here that are being measured on a day-to-day basis with regards to this index. But you also see some of the results. So the companies that are being measured are overall over-indexing on the metrics that we have in place within that index. And it's really important, again, because we speak to investors, and this is a very important, close-to-home issue for many of the companies and many of the investors that are looking into these companies. I thought it would be also worth giving you kind of a quick look. I talked about our Bloomberg events as an important business that's growing very rapidly. Off the back of the Me Too movement earlier this year, or late last year, Bloomberg also thought, we have to walk the walk, and we need to also look at the business angle, because we always look at the business angle of every story. But let's look at how being gender diverse and how being diverse in terms of, again, sexual orientation and ethnic and race is actually really good for people's businesses. So we held our first Business of Equality Summit back in May. Very successful. We had about 400 attendees who came from various ranks throughout various industries, very top-level people in the organizations who came to listen to people like the founders of the Me Too movement, Ashley Judd, actress and activist, who was one of the first to call out the Harvey Weinstein behavior. She came and spoke, Diane von Furstenberg, and very powerful women who have made significant changes to our industry and to the world, in fact. So this is this will be an ongoing franchise that we'll continue to do, again, to look at how, again, it's good for business if you can be diverse. I only have one more slide, which again, I've talked about what we're doing internally. We've had a chief diversity officer in place for a couple of years now. We have several interest organizations as well, which, from Peter Grauer, who was our chairman, and Michael Bloomberg, this is very much at the forefront of their agenda and what they think in terms of what is important to be a company in the 21st century. Is you want to have as diverse of a workforce as possible to bring different ideas and different perspectives to the table. Our chairman, Peter Grauer, is part of the 30% Club. I'm not sure if, how many people know the 30% Club, but I believe it started in Europe, brought to the US, and Peter Grauer assumed sort of the chairmanship of it. But it's essentially to ensure that we're getting to at least 30% of representation on boards of companies around the country. So again, very much near and dear to our heart. Our chairman takes a very, very active role in ensuring that this is permeating throughout the organization. And that's all I have.
Muchas gracias, Christine, por compartir tu experiencia y la del medio donde trabajas. Y ahora es el turno de Alice Dean de New York Times. Ella nos va a también contar una experiencia muy interesante sobre el trabajo que hay desde su medio y todo el tema del movimiento Me Too, que también marcó todo este contexto, el contexto actual, y que también, bueno, en su momento Norma también nos va a contar en relación a lo que fue todo el movimiento, todo el movimiento Ni Una Menos, que ha marcado también a América Latina. Bueno, ahora el turno de Alice.
This is where, can I close this? Is this okay? Yes. Buenas tardes. Es un placer estar en esta asamblea de la CIP en Salta y compartir este panel con mujeres tan distinguidas. Lamento no hablar español, por lo que cambiaré a inglés para mi presentación. Gracias. Thank you. So, since this is about women in news media, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I've been with the New York Times for 18 years. I'm on my fifth job within the Times. It's been a great adventure for me in terms of the support I've gotten as a woman at the Times. And so my current role right now is I oversee our commercial and operations of our licensing business globally. And so what I want to show you here is this is a photo that we dug out of our photo archives. It's from 1958. And you can easily mistake it for a group of women at a university studying, doing work, maybe a group of women at a lab. It's actually a group of women at the New York Times on, I believe it's on the 9th floor in the newsroom, separated from the rest of the newsroom, which were mostly men. 1958, New York Times. Who would have believed it? I didn't realize this until someone showed me this photo. And so this was interesting because all women who started at the New York Times back in those days came through this group. and they were focused on what we called, at the time, the women's news section. It was the 4 Fs: food, fashion, family, and furnishings. Every woman had to go through this group. And this section ran in the paper from 1955 to around 1971. And what was interesting about, we'll call it the 4 Fs group, is that because it was completely overlooked by the rest of the organization, 2 things happened. This group was able to experiment more in terms of the way they produced their reporting beyond sort of the norms and established in those days. And the second was that it fostered really strong lifetime relationships and friendships among the women, which if you fast forward it into the 1970s, a woman by the name of Betsy Wade, who was the New York Times' first female copy editor, led and organized the 1974 class action sex discrimination suit against the New York Times. And she started here in this group on the 9th floor, whatever floor it was, but separate from the newsroom. And she led to what was going to be pretty groundbreaking. The New York Times settled 4 years later, and pretty much the settlement changed the way women's roles were in the newsroom. So I thought it was a great, just sort of indicative of how far we've come, but a lot more that we have to do. So the New York Times, our mission is pretty simple. It's to help people understand the world. And we do that through lots of ways, whether it's through our reporting in text, our photos, our videos, our audio, podcasts, our television production, any way that we can help people understand the world better, we try to do that in all platforms. We are the largest 7-day-a-week newspaper in the United States. We cover about 17 different sections or topics. We have over 1,400 journalists based in 32 international bureaus, and that number is actually growing. We've invested in a lot of our reporting, especially in the White House for obvious reasons, but in a lot of other places as well. We have journalists reporting from over 150 countries globally that in aggregate speak about 57 different languages, and if you ask me which ones those are, I can't list those for you, but that's a lot. And then we also have we've been awarded 125 times the Pulitzer Prize, which is twice as much as our nearest competitor. So our mission is simple, but our newsroom accomplishes that mission without fear or favor. And that's really important because in many ways we've decided a number of years ago, 2-3 years ago, we made a big bet against how we wanted to move our organization forward. We decided that we were going to be a subscription-first consumer brand organization. It's very different from saying that you're a news organization. We're still very much a news organization. Back in the day, we were very much advertising driven. But by making that commitment to being subscription-first consumer brand meant that we had to change the way we work and the way we recruit and the way we do our business and the way we report. And so I can say that so far, the experiment's been working pretty well. We've been pretty happy with that because we have about 3.8 million paid subscribers globally. About 2.9 million of that is digital only, the rest is print. But 15% of our subscription base is coming out of the United States. And so as we build our breadth and our depth across outside the US, it's becoming ever more important for us to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. So why does this all matter? Well, research has shown that diversity, and I use diversity and women, they're related. There's really no way to kind of separate the two. But research has shown that diversity drives innovation, that ultimately leads to profitability. Some of the most successful companies in the world, if you look at their workforce, have a very diverse workforce at all levels of the organization. A workforce that reflects our audience also improves our ability to produce product that meets their needs, whether it's the journalism or the way we deliver the content or the format in which we deliver the content is so important. And if we don't have a diverse audience, a diverse workforce, it will be hard for us to meet those needs. And in addition, if your company is diverse, it leads to lower turnover because people are more engaged and happy. And lower turnover means less cost in terms of recruiting. And not only less cost in terms of recruiting, but more positive PR messages when you are recruiting. So, at the Times, besides just hearing a lot about the research that's out there. We also know this to be a fact because we report on it again and again and again. And so these are just a couple of headlines from the New York Times over the last couple of years as it relates specifically to women in the workforce. I also went into the archives to see what else has been reported, and these were some quotes I took out from archives basically in the last year. David Leonhardt opinion column stated, "Journalism is dominated by male voices." An article back in early February, "Women are underrepresented in news coverage by 3-to-1 ratio, which only reflects and deepens our gender biases and who is considered an authority. Women face higher costs in using Twitter," so that's our journalists, "in the form of harassment and sexual threats." And on the business side, women are, and also in the newsroom, women are twice as likely as men to be interrupted. And this is even worse if you're a woman of color. Many of you may have heard that earlier this year, a female editor from the BBC quit her position because of a gender pay gap at the BBC. So as you can see, there's a lot of coverage right now as it relates to diversity and as it relates to women in media and in business in general. So for diversity inclusion to support our mission, we need to ensure that we have the diverse workforce. And because we made that decision, we decided that we wanted to be held accountable to our own words and even our own reporting. And so our organization decided earlier this year to publicly release a diversity report on how we're doing and make ourselves accountable to our own diversity goals. And there were 3 things that we wanted to bring out that was important for our position. First is reporting and journalism. So journalists and editors with diverse backgrounds reflect the society that we cover. Obviously, as we become more global, society is very different, and so we want to make sure that we can continue to enrich our reporting. So a couple things that have happened. Last year, we launched the Gender Initiative, which is headed by Francesca Donner, and its goal is to elevate and amplify the coverage of gender and engage women readers around the globe. So it's not just coverage, but we have a good percentage of our readership that are female, but engaging them in conversation, listening to them, seeing what else that is important for us to cover that they want to see coverage in. We also then hired our first gender editor, who is responsible for driving that coverage on how gender shapes all of our reporting. So whether it's in business, in science, in sports, in politics, we want to make sure that we have that balanced coverage. We also, interesting enough, created this project. It's called the Overlooked Project. I'm not sure if many of you have heard about it, but it started when a female digital producer got assigned to the obituary section of our paper. And obituaries are very popular for some reason for us. And she noticed, because she wanted to look up some names of females that she was curious in reading about, she noticed that there was a lack of coverage around females in the obituary section. It turned out that in our history, only 15 to 20% of all of our obituaries reported were women. And that hasn't really changed in that time. And so what transpired after that was, in collaboration with Jessica Bennett, who is our gender editor, was a project where we went back and said which women made differences in the world and should have deserved to have gotten an obituary from the Times that didn't in our history, and started creating these obituaries. And so every week we create a new one around women. And it's drawn a lot of attention, enough of attention that we think it might actually be a television production at some point. So a great example of how women in the newsroom are trying to impact the coverage from the Times. And then finally, in 2018, we were awarded, along with the New Yorker, the Public Service Pulitzer Prize for covering the harassment of women in Hollywood. The picture here, which is so different, the one all the way on the left, which is so different from the picture I showed you from 1958, is a picture from when the Pulitzers were announced, and you can see these are the women that not only led the coverage, but pretty much managed the whole thing. And so it, along with also our coverage of Bill O'Reilly and some other male figures, many women are participating in this coverage more and more. So that's one pillar. The second pillar is growing our audience. So currently our readership is comprised of about 49% female in print, but a much higher number in digital, about 56%. We have a younger audience via social media and certain coverage, and also in mobile. So for us to continue to build on that number, we want to make sure the coverage reflects their needs. And even though we're trying to grow our female readership and our younger audience readership as well, we hope that the coverage that we have serves all genders. And then the third piece is it's at the end, it's all about the bottom line, right? So even though this is morally, it's a great thing, we also think that from a business perspective, it means more profits, it means better productivity, creating policies around issues that matter to women that not only beneficial to women, but ultimately also beneficial to men, which I'll touch on later, all matter in terms of the way we want diversity and inclusion in our workplace. So before I share our numbers, this is some data from the marketplace. These numbers are U.S. only. So keep in mind as I read these numbers to you that more than half of the population in the United States is comprised of women. So a report back in 2017 from the Women Media Center on the status of women in news media showed that men still dominate U.S. media. They receive 62% of bylines in media. Women receive 38%. That number is a lot worse if you're talking about TV media, and a lot better if you're talking about digital-only news organizations. In that same report, the New York Times showed that we were only slightly better, but it's nothing to really celebrate. Women received 39% of the bylines, even though that number had increased from 32% from the prior report. But women also only make up the majority of the workforce in about 17 to 20% of the news organizations. The numbers are, as you can see from the chart, much better for the online-only organizations. And so you probably have to wonder, what are the online organizations doing that's different from the print or legacy organizations? I think I read somewhere that most online news organizations tend to have more flatter structures, which may contribute to that. A separate report in 2016 from the Association of News Editors in the U.S. showed that women journalists made up about 38% of staffs in U.S.-based newsrooms. That number, if you looked at the online-only news sites, go up to half, 50%. So as part of our diversity report, we disclosed some of our own numbers and how women are faring at the New York Times. So our numbers are moving in the right direction. We're pleased with it, but we know it's not far enough and it's not fast enough. Over the past 3 years, representation of women have increased at every level at the Times. We represent now about 50% of the employee base. That number is slightly better in the business side of the organization, the business departments, slightly worse in the news organization, and just worse when it comes to leadership. Leadership here is defined as basically directors and above and deputy editors and above. If you were to kind of parse that out, I would suspect those numbers look a lot worse as you move up the chain. There's still a lot to do, and I mentioned some of the accomplishments we've had in terms of in the news area, the gender initiative and the editor. We are also spending a lot of time around recruiting and hiring. So some of the steps we've taken around that is ensuring that we have policies and tools and training to minimize unconscious bias, which is something that we're all human. We all have some biases, and a lot of times we're not conscious of it. And the training is to enable us to be more aware of our own unconscious bias and to take that into account when we're recruiting. And so we've started doing that. I would say we're still in the process of getting the entire staff through it, but as people go through it, it gets then put back into the recruiting process. We've also expanded our outreach to underrepresented groups, whether it's racial or gender or otherwise. We've started to do more of the outreach, which we haven't done in the past. And then finally, we've also trying to broaden the pipeline of journalists for the entire industry through our Student Journalism Initiative, which is a program, a training program for diverse college students. But beyond just the numbers I shared and some of the things we've done, we know that even if the numbers look great, that what's more important is making people feel valued and welcome in the workplace. It's not enough just to bring them in. They have to feel part of that once they're in the organization and part of the culture. So we continue to have employee surveys every year. There's focus groups that follow that, and we take that feedback and generate some solutions that are possible. We've been told, as a whole, as an organization, that we can do better in the areas of communication, in the areas of onboarding and mentorship, and in the areas of career development. Once again, you can bring as many women or diverse individuals into the organization, but they don't feel that they're welcome, they're just going to leave, and that's just a waste of time and money for everyone. So what we've done is we have a number of different employee resource groups in the organization. One of the biggest and most involved is the Women's Network Organization. And what they did a number of years ago, which is really interesting, is there were a number of women that were about to have children. And I would say that this was a millennial group. And they decided that the parental leave policy, which at the time was the maternity leave policy, was quite poor. And I should know, because I went through it, it wasn't a great policy. And only women received it, men did not receive it. They went about researching, finding the best-in-class leave policies that are out in the marketplace, putting together a business case, then presenting to our CEO and the head of HR to pretty much prove that by instituting this enhanced policy, that would be better for business. And it was approved. And the nice thing is, people might say, well, you know, doing this for women, that's great for women, but what about the men, and what about the people left behind? Well, the reason why it's called parental leave is that not only do women get it, men receive it as well. And this is paid leave. So we used to, I believe, I may get the numbers wrong, we used to get 8 weeks of paid leave as a woman. Now I think you get 16. Men got nothing. Men now get 10 weeks. And so this is a great example of a policy change driven by women that has actually benefited everyone in the organization. It's one of the things that people talk about as something that's great about the New York Times once they're an employee at the New York Times. So while these actions are a good step in the right direction, we clearly know there's a lot more to do. And we also know we're not the only organization grappling with these changes. And so we always welcome sharing of ideas and learning about best practices, because we don't think we know we don't have the answers, but we want to just build the momentum and move in the right direction. So how do we think we're doing now based on some of these initiatives? So this gives you a sense of progress on how we're hiring of new women. So in the past year, we've seen that of the new hires that come to New York Times, a little over 60% of them are women. That's a great number in itself. Obviously, it doesn't tell the whole story because we're just starting to collect the data. It'll be interesting to see what happens to that 60% in 2, 3, 4 years, the existing 60% and future 60%. But it gives us hope that maybe we're moving in the right direction, but clearly time will only tell. And we only could do this if there's commitment and accountability, and the commitment has to come from the top. So we do have that commitment from the CEO all the way down. We are going to hold ourselves accountable every year by publicly releasing a report on how we're doing in diversity. It'll be the good, the bad, the ugly. I'm sure there'll be some good, interesting stuff to talk about in that. There will also be managerial accountability, similar to what Christine mentioned at Bloomberg. All the managers who have staff, we have access to a dashboard that shows us of our profile of our entire group and how we're doing over time. So as we hire for open positions, in the back of our mind, we're thinking, okay, are we hiring for a diverse group of individuals? Is our interview panel diverse so that we can combat and minimize unconscious bias? And so that is something we're going to use data more to help drive our decision. There's no right number, and we're not striving for any right number. I guess we'll know when things feel right. And then finally, we also we signed the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a group of committed organizations willing to work together to share initiatives and ideas for the betterment of diversity and inclusion. So that's it for me. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alice. Bueno, ahora es el turno, vamos a cerrar esta parte y luego va a haber alguna oportunidad, unos minutos para algunas preguntas también del público, aunque el tiempo nos está ganando, pero vamos a cerrar esta parte de presentaciones con Norma Morandini y bueno, va a ser un gusto, ella es una gran oradora, no necesita PPT, va a hablarnos así desde la gran experiencia que tiene.
Muchísimas gracias por la invitación y me preguntaba todo el tiempo cómo concitar la atención a la siesta sin lo tecnológico, nada más que con la palabra, algo que a las mujeres no se nos permitió hasta hace algún tiempo. Éramos educadas para susurrar, mi generación tuvo que gritar para que la atendieran y hoy... Gracias. Y hoy, por suerte, ellas estamos legitimadas por las leyes, además tienen la capacidad del argumento, entonces ya no hace falta gritar. Yo navego a varias aguas, entonces siempre que tengo que hablar nunca sé qué hago, porque en la universidad hay que llevar un texto escrito, porque si no parece que uno no ha trabajado. En el periodismo hay que hacer que uno improvise, aunque a veces improvisamos mucho. Y en la Cámara, en el Congreso, no se puede leer, aunque muchas veces no se cumpla con esto. De modo que voy a tomar un poquito de cada cosa con algunas cuestiones que no quisiera dejar de decir hoy en esta reunión. La ventaja que tienen los años, aunque no se vean, los otros no las ven, uno puede mirar de dónde viene, de dónde venimos, y en ese sentido alcanza con contar, yo soy una típica chica de los años 70, en la universidad me formé en periodismo, no me enseñaron que el periodismo, su rol fundamental era inherente al sistema democrático. Cuando vine a Buenos Aires y entré a Clarín, me dijeron no le digas a nadie que has salido de la universidad. De modo que ni en la universidad ni en las redacciones reflexionábamos sobre el papel de la prensa como inherente al sistema democrático. Tampoco las mujeres podíamos firmar. Yo salí sin nombre. Recuerdo que lo máximo que conseguí era firmar unos reportajes con NM que tuvieron repercusión y hablaban del periodista Morandini como si yo fuese un hombre. Pero lo más grave de esto es que a mí no me parecía mal. Es decir, yo empecé a pensar sobre todas estas cuestiones con el tiempo y sobre todo cuando fui al exilio, porque el exilio me dio el gran privilegio de ejercer periodismo en libertad. Yo trabajé en una prensa emblemática de la España que se democratizaba, como era Cambio 16, y lo primero que me hicieron firmar cuando yo ingresé a Cambio 16 era mi compromiso con la democracia. De modo que mi formación fue una formación, es decir, no solo porque era una víctima de la dictadura que tuvo que exiliarse, sino que en la democratización de España y de Portugal, que era donde yo vivía, ahí fui apreciando lo que significa efectivamente la prensa para la democracia. Avanzamos tanto que no ha pasado tanto tiempo. Yo salí sin nombre y volví a las páginas de opinión de Clarín. No ha pasado tanto tiempo. Sin embargo, es cierto que hoy somos más, es cierto que cada vez hay más editoras y sin embargo me gustaría sí ya no hablar de mí, sino contarles la indagación que hice cuando supe que tenía que venir a compartir con ustedes este tema. Me decía Milagro que mencionara el tema del Ni Una Menos, que es un movimiento muy original, como los argentinos siempre somos tan originales, nacido en Argentina, pero de una situación dramática, de las periodistas que en la televisión todos los días daban noticias policiales de asesinatos de mujeres a manos de aquellos que decían amarlas, sus maridos, sus esposos, sus novios, y este es casi lo que compartimos en las pantallas de casi todos nuestros países, por lo menos en esta parte del mundo, y a partir de una periodista que dijo basta, ¿qué vamos a hacer para no tener que seguir dando estas informaciones. Y creado por periodistas, este movimiento que se llama Ni Una Menos, que uno tiene que pensar qué es Ni Una Menos. Y tiene una fuerza filosófica porque es ni una menos en la vida. Las mujeres estamos habituadas a denunciar siempre la muerte. Las argentinas tenemos una tradición de madres del dolor en la plaza pública. Madres que denuncian la muerte de sus hijos, que desgraciadamente en nuestra historia contemporánea no hemos erradicado, porque tenemos madres del dolor por los desaparecidos, por el Paco, por la violencia policial, por el tránsito. Y entonces lo que ha pasado, lo que a mí me parece que es la riqueza de este grupo de las mujeres, es que han puesto alegría en la plaza. Es decir, no queremos que nos maten, queremos vivir, que tiene un gran significado de cambio de tal vez ser un poco el victimario que siempre estamos hablando de las cosas malas que nos han pasado, la discriminación, etcétera, etcétera. Quisiera ocuparme ya en la parte, la mitad de lo que quería compartir con ustedes, pero estuve todo el tiempo escuchando, es decir, hablamos de la industria, hemos hablado de negocios, la irrupción de lo digital, cómo está afectando al negocio, la creatividad que hay que tener para la industria. Y yo recordé que en los 90, con María Eugenia Estensoro, una amiga, hermana, periodista también que venía de ejercer periodismo fuera del país, fundamos una revista que se llamó Mujeres y Compañía. Queríamos hacer una revista fashion con estética femenina, pero con un contenido diferente, que no era un contenido de reivindicación, sino de preparación, contribuir a poner en debate los temas de las mujeres en el trabajo, sobre todo las mujeres en las empresas, es decir, qué significa cuando la mujer tiene que pasar al espacio público a trabajar con varones, lo que le significa la tensión permanente entre la familia y el trabajo. Y yo estoy segura que nos separan muchos años de diferencia y nos separan, por suerte, una evolución democrática en nuestros países, pero seguro que vamos a seguir compartiendo algunas cuestiones que tienen que ver la culpa si dejamos a los hijos, la presión de la estética que tenemos sobre nosotras. Y como anécdota, para no ponerme densa, y si me perdonas, cuando quise averiguar quiénes eran mis copanelistas, entré en Google y entonces puse el nombre de Alice y lo primero que me apareció era con quién ella se había casado. Eran las noticias de su matrimonio. Entonces fui a googlear también el nombre de su marido, pero de su marido no aparecía con quien él se había casado. Pongo el ejemplo, es decir, porque sigue habiendo culturalmente, es decir, todavía hay dos varas y dos medidas para medir las mujeres y medir a los hombres y cómo se nos juzga. Y aquí sí tengo que ponerme densa, porque cuando fui a indagar qué pasa hoy con las mujeres que están en los medios, todas aquellas mujeres que tienen visibilidad pública, paradójicamente aquellas que han denunciado la violencia contra las mujeres, lo que reciben por las redes es espantoso. Son agresiones sexuales, machistas, son horribles. Y yo, cuando me contaban, yo no leo lo que escriben, me protejo con eso, pensé, yo la tuve fácil, porque yo escribía, ni me enteraba, decir qué decían de lo que yo escribía. En cambio, qué fortaleza hay que tener, vale para hombres también. Yo ya no divido la humanidad entre hombres y mujeres, esto dan los años, pero pienso qué difícil que la tienen las mujeres hoy cuando aparecen públicamente, dan opinión públicamente y sin embargo son denostadas, y son denostadas no en lo que dicen, son denostadas no en el argumento, son denostadas sexualmente, ¿no? Entonces me parece que esta es la gran paradoja, que somos más, pero sin embargo vamos a tener que seguir trabajando mucho, y por eso ahora quiero enmarcar lo que me resta de compartir con ustedes porque como hay pocas mujeres en opinión, lo que se registra, le leía un reportaje a Soledad Gallegos, la primera directora de diarios, por lo menos de diarios de este último tiempo, del país de España, y ella, reconociendo lo que pasa, el techo de cristal, la situación de las mujeres, ella dice que el país tiene que trabajar más para que haya más mujeres en las páginas de opinión. Me cuenta una de las periodistas que está escribiendo columnas de opinión, ya no esporádicamente como escribíamos muchas, sino periódicamente en La Nación, que cuando la presentan muchas veces dicen es la primer mujer que escribe columnas políticas después de 140 años. Imagínense ustedes, yo siempre le digo, no lo piense, porque el peso de responsabilidad, uno nunca va a estar a la altura de ser la primera en 140 años, ¿no? Entonces, miren cómo hemos avanzado, pero cómo tenemos este sustrato cultural que todavía nos limita. Quería opinar, quería aprovechar un poco, opinar sobre lo que es casi el tema leitmotiv de esta reunión. Y en relación a las redes, me parece que es muy importante que no perdamos de vista cuál es la función del periodismo. Porque si hay algo que la ventaja de tener años es reconocer que por primera vez, por lo menos en mi vida profesional, están reunidos los dueños de los medios con los periodistas. Esto es algo que en los años 70, 80 y hasta 90 no existía. Porque yo me recuerdo haber peleado siempre mucho con esa idea gremial de las redacciones, porque el producto de una empresa periodística no es la botella, no es la copa, es un producto simbólico, gestiona la libertad de expresión, que por supuesto una empresa poderosa que está ahora debatiendo cómo hace para la publicidad que se va. Cuanto más poderoso en términos económicos es, más tiempo le va a poder dar a sus periodistas. Porque lo que necesita un periodista es tiempo para que podamos volver a trabajar en lo que es la esencia de nuestra actividad, que son los hechos. Las personas confían en nosotros porque somos los que les decimos, es decir, esto es verdad o no es verdad. No digo verdad en sentido absoluto, pero nuestra función es trabajar sobre los hechos. Nosotros tenemos la obligación de ser cuidadosos para que aquello que es un rumor lo desechemos y no publiquemos el rumor como pasa, es decir, vemos mucho que pasa por lo menos en nuestro país. De modo que me parece que volver a insistir en esto que por suerte vimos en el panel anterior, cómo hay una preocupación de las empresas tecnológicas, en el caso que se contaba Facebook, cómo hace para evitar las noticias mentirosas y cómo hacen los periodistas que han decidido hacer mejor periodismo y contarle a los más jóvenes qué es pero sobre todo contarle a la ciudadanía que tiene que ser siempre la razón de nuestro trabajo. Es decir, escuchamos hablar de usuarios, de clientes, pero sobre todo, como estamos comprometidos las empresas y los periodistas en la defensa de la libertad de prensa, siempre tenemos que tener la idea primera de que estamos sirviendo al ciudadano. Porque la idea fundamental de que la prensa es inherente al sistema democrático. ¿Qué contribuye la prensa? ¿Qué es la democracia? La democracia es el sistema de la palabra, porque tenemos la libertad de decir, podemos hablar libremente, sin temor a que nos persigan por nuestra opinión, y vamos dándole a la democracia lo que es su esencia, que es el carácter deliberativo. De modo que nada mide mejor la fortaleza de una democracia que la calidad de su opinión pública. Nada mide mejor el estadio de una democracia que cuál es el desarrollo de su prensa. De modo que me parece muy auspicioso, celebro que parte de esta reunión haya sido discutir también una declaración digital. Y es cierto que todavía hay o prejuicio o no quiero ser dura en mis apreciaciones, pero lo cierto es que mucho de esa declaración está sustentada por lo que son las declaraciones universales de los derechos humanos. De ahí viene la parte de lo que yo he aprendido cuando acepté participar en política. Aprendí todo lo que ignoraba. Aprendí al vicio que solemos tener los periodistas en la generalización. Padecí también esa generalización que me hizo aprender. Por hablar de mí se me fue la idea que traía, pero quería decirles esto. He aprendido, primero, lo que ignoraba, todo lo que sustenta en nuestra Constitución lo que son los tratados internacionales de derechos humanos, que tienen más jerarquía que las leyes. Tenemos un continente que, a pesar de las amenazas populistas y de los casos concretos como puede ser el de Venezuela, y gracias a que tenemos libertad podemos denunciar la mordaza ajena, como los venezolanos denunciaron nuestra mordaza en los años 70, ¿no? De modo que seguir insistiendo por qué es importante tener una prensa independiente formada por hombres y mujeres que hagan de la cultura profesional un valor. Es decir, cuanto mejor formados estemos los periodistas, mejor va a ser la información, y cuanto mejor sea la información, mejor será la ciudadanía. La anécdota con la que cierro: mi experiencia legislativa me ha enseñado, en sociedades como las nuestras, que tienen una cultura autoritaria de tener casi 50 años en nuestras espaldas históricas, con qué facilidad, ayer se hablaba de los legisladores, con qué facilidad se cae en la tentación de controlar. Yo ahora presido el Observatorio de Derechos Humanos del Senado, que una de mis funciones fundamentales es esa, es estar alerta a todo lo que se viene como proyecto legislativo que esté encuadrado dentro de lo que el Estado argentino se ha comprometido en materia de derechos humanos. Por eso tenemos que estar alertas siempre y poner como valor primero la libertad de expresión. A mí me perturba que se insulte anónimamente. He hecho algunas experiencias muy aleccionadoras. Cuando era legisladora respondía personalmente cada uno de los correos que me venían, que me denostaban. Siempre me pidieron disculpas, siempre. Hubo solo un caso de un militar que no me pidió disculpas, pero después siempre. Es decir, en el momento que uno puede humanizar al otro y ponerlo en el mismo plano de igualdad, es decir, la conversación es posible, y la conversación democrática no es posible, es necesaria, es urgente, porque yo creo que el periodismo sigue amenazado, como decía el profesor Furio Colombo, por la censura, por la presión del poder, por la escasez de las fuentes y por el estado de la opinión pública. Y me temo que la opinión pública está desconfiando mucho de la política, está desconfiando mucho de los periodistas, lo que equivale a decir que está desconfiando mucho de la democracia. De modo que celebro que hagamos este esfuerzo colaborativo en defensa de la democracia, que no es una cuestión de hombres y de mujeres. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Vamos a dar, en Milagro, lugar a los participantes. Si quieren hacer alguna pregunta, por favor, allí están nuestras secretarias que les van a acercar los micrófonos. Levantamos la mano para formular nuestras inquietudes y así abrimos el panel. Milagro.
Bueno, sí, yo quería hacer una pregunta para luego pasar la oportunidad al público, Nuria. Quería preguntar un poco en la idea de reflexionar sobre qué prácticas se han naturalizado y que debemos de repensar y debemos mirar dentro de la industria de los medios sobre el papel de las mujeres. Un poco en la línea de lo que mencionabas, que al inicio no te parecía mal firmar como NM, Norma, y que te parecía normal, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son aquellas prácticas que se han naturalizado, normalizado y que deberíamos mirar para estar atentos y ver cómo redefinimos y repensamos lo que está pasando dentro de las industrias? Se lanza.
Well, I could talk to the business side. So I mentioned earlier that women tend to be interrupted more in meetings, and one of the things that was interesting when I started participating in a lot of the just gatherings of the Women's Network is how frequent it was happening. But not only interruptions in meetings, and these were colleagues, male colleagues that we all, work really well with. Once again, sometimes you just don't know your own, what you do consciously. But interruptions, male colleagues were getting more of the credit for some of the ideas, even if the idea was initially created by a woman. And so for many of us, the women speaking at these roundtables, we decided that rather than compete against each other, that we would support each other in meetings. And so there's also this history, because there were so few women in business, that the ones that were in business, it was much more competitive because you have so few. And if you're going to be the one token woman on a panel or in a meeting, you need to be the one in exclusion of other women. And that doesn't have to be the case. And so what we started doing with a lot of women at the times is when you're in meetings with other women and someone gets interrupted or someone's idea gets taken as credit for somebody else, one of us will say something and speak up or bring the meeting back. It was a commitment to ourselves as we were talking at these roundtables, because it's just until you do it often enough, it'll just continue to happen. It's not to say it's going to stop. And of course, there are also women that interrupt men as well. And so, but that was a big part of trying to make it a little bit different. I know personally for myself, I'm the type of person that won't speak up as much. As an Asian American woman, culturally, you're taught to be quieter, to follow the rules, all those things. It took me many years and therapy to get to a point where I don't feel anxious about interrupting or anxious about speaking up, but it's still very uncomfortable for me. But I think if you do it more, it will change.
I'll add on to Alice's point there. Personally, I'm also on the business side within Bloomberg. Self-reflection. I am somebody who's more thoughtful sitting in meetings. I'm not the first one to be speaking up necessarily and dominating a conversation, but I think over time in business, or up till now, I think there was an expectation, whether that was overt, most likely not overt, but there's an expectation that successful women, or if you wanted to be successful, you also needed to carry a demeanor that was very much reflective of sort of the aggressive, outgoing, very outspoken male. And the reality is, I think in any organization, like a family, there are different personalities, and what makes a really effective organization are people from different viewpoints. People can bring different attributes to a conversation. So I think that is, certainly when I look at Bloomberg, I think there is still that undertone of, if you want to have a voice, you better speak up, which I do agree with, but I don't think you necessarily have to be the first one leading the conversation. I think there needs to be an understanding that even if you're going, again, you don't need to sort of assume these, what tend to have been in the past male-dominated traits to be able to be successful and to be a leader in your organizations.
Ya ven que ahora es la parte más interesante porque hablamos de la cultura y hablamos de las dificultades, que ahí no hay un tema de edad. Quiero completar el ejemplo que di, que cuando hicimos Mujeres y Compañía, esta revista, bueno, teníamos anunciantes de petróleo, pero no de maquillaje. Y a su vez, porque no nos veían como una revista de mujeres, y a su vez las mujeres no nos veían como una revista femenina, ¿no? Pongo este ejemplo como, es decir, vamos evolucionando y sin embargo permanecen estas descalificaciones si hablas alto y si además, lo que decíamos antes, yo creo que las mujeres, como no somos educadas para susurrar, entonces hablar en público no es algo, creo que a los hombres tampoco les resulta sencillo hablar en público. A las mujeres nos cuesta más, yo estoy más entrenada nada más. Pero me doy cuenta que es una inhibición grande, porque después las descalificaciones siempre es loca, yo lo voy a decir, debe haber algún colega brasileño que son mucho más elegantes para decir que, como se dice brutalmente en nuestro país, pero cuando una mujer se destaca mucho, seguro que es una mala amada, ¿no? Y eso es un mal amada. Es un descalificativo fuerte, ¿no? Pero yo creo que la descalificación de loca, porque hoy políticamente correcto no se dice, pero esas son cosas que una mujer siente el juicio, y a veces es duro reconocer que es el juicio de las otras mujeres, porque no se entra en el modelo, o qué habrá hecho, o cómo, es decir, esto que decía antes de la tensión entre la familia y los hijos. Ya que hablo de la tensión de la familia y los hijos, yo creo realmente que atraviesa todo lo que hemos estado hablando, la tensión entre lo que interesa y lo que importa. La tentación es lo que interesa porque es el rating, cuando en realidad la función que tenemos como periodistas es decir qué es lo que importa. Y entonces este tipo de temas, a mí me parece que hay que traerlos. Podemos ponernos de acuerdo, reconocernos, me pasó esto, te cuento qué cosas hemos vivido. Pero yo celebro esto de que también lo personal pueda ser puesto, que ayuda a otras mujeres a identificar y ayuda también a los hombres a ir creciendo al lado nuestro y ir erradicando esas miradas de descalificación cultural, ¿no?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Nuria, tú tenías una pregunta, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Nuria Piera, de República Dominicana. ¿Me oye?
Encendemos a ver.
Hello. Gracias. Nuria Piera, de República Dominicana. Bueno, pensaba yo que el hecho de que tengamos que tener ese tema aquí significa que estamos todavía muy atrasados. Que tengamos todavía que hablar de la posición de la mujer en los medios y hacer paneles sobre eso significa que debemos seguir trabajando y avanzando. Pero pienso yo que un grado importante para saber cómo se avanza en empresas tan importantes como las de ustedes dos es saber si tienen, por ejemplo, en su mente el conocimiento de cuántas mujeres están sentadas en la junta directiva. ¿Lo saben?
It's a really good question. I was thinking about that coming into this conversation. To give you context, Bloomberg is really, there's one person that runs Bloomberg and owns Bloomberg. It's Michael Bloomberg, who makes the biggest decisions and the important ones. But there is a management committee that runs our organization. Up until 2 weeks ago, it was led by 3 people, and it was Michael Bloomberg, Peter Grauer, who is the chairman, I was referring to him a little bit, who champions diversity and inclusion, among many other things in our organization, and Tom Secunda, who was one of the other founders who came up with the Bloomberg Terminal in partnership with Michael Bloomberg. 2 weeks ago, 3 new members were announced, which is great, it's progress. 2 men and 1 woman, 2 being part of the core Bloomberg business, as well as our chief financial officer. So if you think about that in terms of percentages, it's not 30%, which is ironic because Peter Grauer is part of the 30% club or leads it, but it is progress. And I agree with you that the progress, I mean, it's funny we're having this conversation now. It's hysterical, the picture that you showed at the start of your conversation, because I thought it was a lab in NASA. You know, I watched this movie several weeks ago about the women in NASA, but I think when I look at leadership in our organization as well, and to be very sincere and very honest, not at the board level, but sort of the leadership level, our CEOs, we are very, very dominated by males on both sides of the organization, the Bloomberg Media as well as the Bloomberg Terminal business. And, you know, the financial world is quite male dominated, so it does reflect that, given that's our core consumer business. But what I've noticed in the past 2 years, and I was telling this to Allison, my colleague who was here also, Claudia, is in the past 2 to 3 years, I've seen quite a change in not the senior leadership level, but the level right below that. So senior managers, senior executives, I look around and I'm essentially now in meetings where there might be 1 man, but many of the people in the room who are sort of looking and developing product and who are looking to lead the business and who are at the seat of editorial are women, in fact. So I think there is absolutely, like in most organizations, there's still a glass ceiling, and we will break through, but the progress is slow. And that is sort of frustrating when I look at, and I'll give you a little sort of personal thing. I don't know why, but I think many people, many women I talk to, but with Trump coming into power, the light switch shifted on. I've never been somebody who's very much about, very active in terms of women's rights, but when Trump came into power, the light switch came on. I have a daughter who's 4 years old, and I look around, and I've been so much more engaged in mentorship now, like working with younger women. And I think the only way that we can kind of continue to help break through and get women higher is by supporting women and finding men who will support those women as well. I've been really fortunate in my career that I've had a lot of men who've helped champion me through my growth. And I think that needs to be part of the equation. And I think there's a lot of men in my organization who do see that and who embrace that. So I'm fortunate. But I'd love to see 3 women and 3 men in the management committee someday really soon.
Bueno, al final en la mesa directiva nadie, ni una mujer. Una sola.
Patty Roskill, sí.
En los
Una de-
derechos
de
humanos.
6.
Que tiene que ver con los derechos humanos.
No.
Okay.
So this is the leadership position across the entire organization. Within editorial, 2 men.
Okay.
Below that, 1 woman who leads our global editorial standards, diversity and inclusion, and several. And then as you get lower, the mix becomes much more fair. Yeah.
Entendí. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Perdón, falta New York Times. A ver,
Ay,
Isabel.
disculpa. Sí.
Hi. I echo everything Christine said. At the New York Times, I don't know the exact number on the board, but it's predominantly men and predominantly white male. So it's an area that obviously should be, we would like to improve that. But similarly to Bloomberg, once you get below the executive committee level, you're seeing a lot more movement as it involves more women being promoted into more senior positions. That wasn't the case a few years ago. So if I think about our executive committee, we have our COO is a woman. She is a force to be reckoned with, and she's the driving force behind our digital subscriptions. Our head counsel is a woman as well. Unfortunately, our chief data officer was a woman, left us for a much better position, so hopefully we'll replace that with another woman. But you're starting to see, at the VP level, director level, a lot more women taking on roles that you didn't see before, taking on positions. That's not to say there's still not a lot of room for improvement, because there totally is a lot of room. On the topic of the male ally, I've been also very fortunate in that I've had great mentors that were both men and women. And my current boss is a man. I think some of you may actually even know him, Michael Greenspan. He's part of the Sulzberger family. And he's, my staunchest male ally. I actually brought him with me to a networking event, a women's networking event outside of the Times a number of months ago, where they asked people to bring male allies. And the thing that struck him the most was, we walked into the room, and it was predominantly women. A lot of women didn't bring male allies. And he said, wow, it's so important for women to also have male allies, in addition to women supporting themselves, because it's not just a women's issue in itself, it's a women and a men's issue together.
Bueno, con esta pregunta podemos cerrar porque estamos contra
La sugerencia es, por favor, todas las inquietudes las vamos a poder realizar después de este espacio, porque van a quedar a disposición los panelistas, pero realmente no podemos porque estamos muy apretados con los tiempos.
Okay, bueno, entonces será luego del panel. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, un aplauso para estas mujeres, por favor, y gracias por participar.
Muchísimas gracias a nuestros panelistas, Norma Morandini, Christine Morgan, Alice Ting y por supuesto a Milagros Salazar, y nuestra moderadora. A ustedes, señores, simplemente encarecidamente pedirles disculpas porque, bueno, tenemos todavía una ardua agenda que cumplir en lo que resta de nuestra jornada, un acontecimiento tan importante como es la entrega de premios que nos va a llevar a trasladarnos hasta el Teatro Provincial. Para aquellos que deseen tomar un cafecito lo pueden hacer. Nosotros vamos a permanecer aquí porque ya inmediatamente vamos a dar continuidad al próximo panel, que es el último ya para nuestra jornada, y por supuesto también convocarlos, aquellos que quieran tomarse un cafecito o aquellos que quieran participar de una degustación que nos invita a Finca Cuara en el Salón Terracota. Allí el sommelier José Luis Munier nos está esperando para una cata de vinos. Señoras y señores, convocamos a los próximos panelistas porque el tema que se va a abordar a continuación tiene que ver con las noticias falsas en circunstancias críticas o muy especiales de un país como pueden ser las elecciones electorales. Así que convocamos a nuestro próximo moderador, panelistas, para ya dar continuidad al siguiente panel. Muchas gracias.